Debbie Conway graduated from Hiram College with a BA in History and Biology. She worked as a manager for the National Park Service for nearly 37 years before her retirement in the fall of 22. She currently serves as president of the Waterville Historical Society, which I just happen to be on the board there, so that's why I called out a few favors when our speaker was supposed to speak and had a chance. So without further ado, I want to introduce Debbie Conway.
You guys hear me? Let's make sure we have it on. And just go up or forward and come out. So if all of a sudden during the presentation you can't hear me, let me know, because it probably means I wiggle the cord out somehow. We'll have to pop it back in. So, well, thank you for having me today. Just before we get started, anybody here ever gone on the Waterville Historical Society Loomis Country Tours? Okay, a few folks. Excellent. We have the descendants of the Loomis Gang here. Okay, so there's one hand in the back there. Okay, excellent. What is it? It's not plugged in?
No, it's not working.
Okay. All right. It seems to pop really easily. So even though I thought I might be able to move around a little bit, I might be a statue up here. So I don't knock it out. When Wade called the other week and asked if I could kind of pinch hit for you guys today on do a program on Loomis, he goes, "What's the name of your program?" And for the life of me, I could not remember what I called it. So I just said, "Oh, history of the Loomis Gang." But it's actually, I call it Loomisania because that is actually what became sort of a regular standing header in the Waterville Times. Probably about in the 1860s, there was so much activity with the Loomis Gang, and everybody was keeping a pulse on what was happening and who was indicted and who was arrested and so forth. But they just had this standing header, Loomisania, and so you could get the latest and greatest about their exploits under that header. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the Loomis Gang. Some of you that have been on the tour, some of this will be familiar, but if you haven't been on the last year or two, we've kind of updated our Loomis Country Tours, really pulling in some of the primary source materials from the Waterville Times in particular. So a couple times today I will read some excerpts from the Times because quite honestly, it's so much more colorful than what I could do trying to just describe it. So it's a little bit more fun to hear it from their words at the time when it was happening, when they were actually living it. So that's one of the things that we've kind of changed up the last couple of years. So obviously, I think a couple of us were joking about how the Loomis armored cars, are they related? Would that really be who you would trust with your money? Because we kind of know this notorious gang that lived close to us here, right? But the Loomis family really descended from, was a very well-known, very prominent family back in England. They were, judges, lawyers, doctors, very prominent. And again, we're going to be talking probably about the most notorious branch of the family that was here in the States and really had their home base just south of Waterville. So, let me find my buttons here. Okay. So this is sort of a rough Loomis family tree that I start off with, so you can see some of the players. And we're going to get started by talking about all the different family members. Obviously, the father of the Loomis Gang was George Washington Loomis. He was born in Union, Connecticut in 1779. His mother died when he was fairly young. And so he was really raised by his father and his sisters. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of George Washington, so we're going to talk about him for a minute while we're on the family tree, and then we'll show you a few documents related to him. He began stealing horses at quite a young age. He always said he liked horses, especially those that didn't belong to him. And so after a while, he moved from Vermont up to where his sister lived when his father passed away, from Connecticut up to Vermont. And at one point up there, the sheriff came to see him and said, he's been noticing the horse population in the Rutland area getting a little smaller, and he was keeping an eye on And it was about 1802 when a posse kind of chased him across the Vermont-New York border, and he ended up kind of deciding it was time to leave living with his sister Charlotte in Vermont and maybe go live with his sister Clarissa outside of Sangerfield, New York. His sister Clarissa was married to Dr. Stephen Preston in the Sangerfield area, and so he came to stay there for a little bit. Now, a few things, we know that when he got here, he started looking for land. He had about $3,000 worth of looking to buy some property. The couple of the things that he wanted to have in his property was he wanted it to be on a high point, so he had a good, clear line of sight, nice, I guess you could say, lookout, and that there was a good place for hiding horses. And so it took him about 3 or 4 years before he ended up buying 15 acres from Jedediah Sanger, who was the founder of Sangerfield. And it was in an area right adjacent to the 9 Mile Swamp. So if you're familiar with the 9 Mile Swamp, it runs from basically Sangerfield out behind where our Waterville High School is today, all the way down to Hubbardsville. And at that time, it was a pretty rough area, very marshy, not someplace that people really went wandering around. So a lot of nice nooks and crannies where you could hide things and hide horses and so forth. So it was right adjacent to that. He paid $15 an acre at the time, and as this ledger refers to the fourth line where you see estate there, that shows 355 acres. Probably at the peak, his property was over 400 acres, but at this point, he had about 355 acres of holdings in the Waterville area. And if I hit the wrong button and we go the wrong direction, let me know, because I keep wanting to tap up front here. One thing we do know about George was that he was a private during the War of 1812, and he actually, I believe, was discharged honorably. He was considered a really good neighbor by his friends and neighbors. He made charcoal, potash, he farmed. He would loan his neighbors money if they needed. He drove the finest horses, which kind of, isn't surprising if he had an eye for horses. It may not have been his own, but he did. And in over 50 years of crime, he was never jailed once, never convicted and sent to jail. Now, Rhoda Millay is sort of the mother of the Loomis Gang. She was born in Connecticut in 1792, and as a child she moved to Paris, New York, with her parents. She later lived in Waterville with her father. See, it's kind of funny, I don't think this is the only picture we have of her, but she was noted for her lovely complexion. Maybe you can't quite see that in that photo, but claims are that she would wash her face every morning with a dew-soaked handkerchief to keep her skin lovely and soft. She was very well educated and even taught school for a short time. And in the style of the day, she wore her black hair really tightly pulled back in a bun. As I mentioned, her parents came from Connecticut, but she often talked about her high French ancestry. She always felt that she was born to be in a privileged class, and she had relatives in Waterville, the Osborns, who were sort of one of the prominent families in Waterville at the time. And she always sort of tried to compete and sort of outdo the Osborns in particular. It's sort of interesting when her first cousin, one of the Osborns, wrote the history of the town of Sangerfield, he didn't mention the Loomises at all. So I don't think the two sides of the family were exceptionally close. Now, Rhoda and George met when he accompanied the sheriff to her father's house. He was going to arrest Rhoda's father for counterfeiting. When the sheriff tried to get inside the house by crawling through a window, Rhoda hit him with a pole shovel. And then when George tried to come to the aid of the sheriff, she did the same thing to him, hit him again. And he was, supposedly the story goes that he said, a woman that would come to the aid of her father will come to the aid of her husband. I'm going to marry that girl. And he did. So they got married. George was 35, Rhoda was 22 when they married in 1814. They began their life together in a small cabin on George's property, which was up on the top of the hillside that they had, and they began raising a family. We'll talk about the kids here in a minute. They were always dressed well. They went to school. She tried to, again, make sure they carried themselves in the way that she thought they should for the privileged positions that they should have in society. She was also known to encourage them to steal. One of her favorite sayings about her is that she said, everybody steals, only the stupid people get caught. And so she encouraged all of them to get into theft. And it really was the family business, quite honestly, between the horse thieving and they do counterfeiting, all that it kind of became the family business for them. Now, as I mentioned, George and Rhoda is going to have a pretty big family. Their first and their 12th child were both girls, both named Harriet, and they both died at the age of 2. And then following Harriet came Callista. She married a lawyer in Whitesboro and died in childbirth in 1854. Then they had their first son, William or Bill, who was born in 1819. Let's just say Bill wasn't the sharpest bulb in the block, in the box. He went into family business. He was a horse thief and a counterfeiter. But he was also the first Loomis on record to actually get convicted and sent to jail for those crimes. So he was not sort of the leader, the smart, savvy kind of leader that they were hoping for with their first son. After Bill came Cornelia. This is the first of the children that we have pictures of. Cornelia was known as the outlaw queen. She never married. She always lived with her mother. She was a very smart girl, even taught school again for a short time. Supposedly detested housework, and I can't say I blame her for that. She tended to compete with her brothers. She was sort of a tall, big boned girl, often cut her hair short and dressed as a man. And I think she sort of had this competition to kind of be part of the gang and out-compete her brothers for sort of some of the antics and some of the things that they did. Now, one of the stories that centers around Cornelia was that she was at a party, and as of the day, just like we do today, when you have a big party in your home, you take all the coats and everything, you stuff them, stick it in one bedroom, and then you have to get them at the end of the night. Well, some young ladies went to go get their coats and their fur muffs at the end of the night, and their muffs were missing. Well, one of them was bold enough to raise up Clarissa's skirt, and they found that she had 4 or 5 muffs on each leg. So they got their muffs back, and to say the least, Clarissa probably was not invited to too many parties for a while after that. Next came George Washington Loomis, known as Wash. Now, Wash was born in 1823. He was the second son. He was the son that they were kind of hoping for. He was smart, he was savvy, kind of a good dresser, ladies' man, really had that kind of charisma that they were hoping, was a good, solid leader. He would actually go to study law under Judge James B. Eldridge in Hamilton. He never took the bar exam, but he would use his law experience and law background to help the gang navigate and circumvent some of the charges that were going to be put against them over the years. For example, when he was 21 in 1844, he was arrested for stealing money from a Waterville store. And he was able to delay the trial using these legal tactics. And after he was finally convicted, the case went to the New York Supreme Court, and he was able to get it overturned on a technicality. So even though he wasn't really a lawyer, he used all that education and learning to be able to help the gang navigate that system. So he would become kind of the leader of the gang. There would always be sort of some back and forth between him and Rhoda over who was in charge. At one point, things got a little hairy for Wash early on, around 1848, when a bunch bunch of the citizens from town came out to the homestead and did what they called the big search, and they found a bunch of stolen property there. And Wash knew that he was probably going to get convicted this time if he wasn't able to get out of town. So he actually went to California, spent a year or so out with the California gold rush, and then came back when things quieted down a little bit. So next up is Grove. Grove was born in 1825. He too was a pretty savvy young man. In some ways, he didn't have the finesse that Wash did, but he was smart, he was a good dresser, liked the ladies, and very much he and Wash were kind of opposites, which you think they might clash, but actually that kind of worked for them, so they tended to get along. He actually learned to breed horses from his father, and could have been a very successful horse breeder if he wanted to stay on the straight and narrow. He, in 1844, bred Wash's Kentucky Hunter with a mare owned by a local farmer, Sam Welch. The resulting filly was Flora Temple. She was a very famous racehorse. There were, I think, cigars and steamboats, and there's a Courier and I lithograph of Flora Temple. Camptown Races, that song includes Flora Temple. When you talk about somebody bet on the bobtail nag, that was Flora Temple. So he could have been very successful in that. He was really good at it. But he was also really good at changing the appearance of horses. So if you wanted to take a horse and sort of lighten its coat, you would bind a hot potato to a spot and repeat that several times, and that would lighten the color, kind of bleach it out. Or if you wanted to darken it, you could rub silver nitrate on the horse's coat, and that and some other chemicals and even paint were often used to kind of hide the horses that they were stealing. And there's two little stories about that's kind of funny. One is that the Loomises supposedly stole a brown horse from a farmer. A few days later, he bought a black horse to replace the brown one. And when he got it back home and started to take it into the barn, it went exactly into the stall it was supposed to. Yes. So another story goes that a man, Thomas Jones, had a pair of black horses stolen near Utica. And several weeks later, he heard about a pair of chestnut horses that were being sold up in Camden. So he went and bought the pair again to replace the ones that he had lost. The chestnuts had white stockings, one with a star in its forehead. They looked very different than what they were, but later the Loomis Gang admitted that those were the same horses as well. So, next was Lucy. She was born in 1828, and she married a Waterville farmer, Edwards, but she died of fever fairly young, so she's not heavily involved in the gang. Following Lucy was Wheeler Theodore, who was born in 1831. He's probably one of the least known of the brothers, in part because of an incident he had early on. He was arrested for attacking a 14-year-old mentally disabled girl. And the family, the Loomises, posted the $2,000 bail for him, and the very next day he hightailed it to Canada. And so he's going to really live majority of his life in Canada, up in, I think, Alexandria, Ontario. He changes his name from Wheeler Theodore Loomis to Theodore Wheeler, no Loomis. He still is involved in the gang up in Canada, but again, he's quite distant and so forth. And he will really stay involved up there in Canada until he dies of cancer in 1911. He is buried in the Sangerfield Cemetery, and he has a marker that one of his sons put on his grave. And before I forget to mention later, but that is one of the few Loomis family members in the cemetery that has a grave marker. At the time of their death, the family knew that they were not well liked, and they were afraid their graves would be desecrated, so they actually asked not to have markers put on their graves at the time. So next up was Charlotte. but we do have the next brother, Amos Plum, who was born in 1834. Supposedly he is the hero of the book, The 9 Mile Swamp, that was produced in 1941, where it talks about a sensitive youth who really knew about the gang but wasn't really part of it. You can look for that book in the fiction section because he was definitely involved in the gang. He was, when we talk a little bit later on about the night of the big incident at the homestead, he was the brother that was hung 3 times that night and trying to get him to confess to his crimes. And then finally we have Hiram Denio, the judge as he was nicknamed, partly after he was named after a judge in the Court of Appeals, which you might find that odd, but apparently that was a judge that really looked favorably on the Loomises, and so Rhoda named him after a judge. He was the youngest and smallest of the kids, boys in particular, and people said he really wasn't quite right. So he was kind of had a temper and sort of had the worst kind of mean streak of the family. He lived with Rhoda pretty much and his sister Cornelia pretty much his whole life. Now, as that family grew, the Loomises needed to have a bigger property. That little cabin that Rhoda and George started out with wasn't going to handle 12 children. So, let's see, I think about 1825, they built a bigger house up on the pinnacle. It was 3 stories. It had a central hallway. It had 2 parlors, 2 kitchens, plenty of fireplaces. It had 7 bedrooms, a storeroom, and a room up in the garret. I mentioned the garret room in particular because some of the tales we'll talk about refer to that garret room where some of the gang members and stuff would hang out at different times. The Loomises tended to live in grand style. I mean, they had, silver place settings, fine meals, fine china. They actually subscribed to the New York Times. They had, besides the house across the street on Mason Road, there was a cattle barn, a hay barn, a horse barn, a house, and a sheep barn. If you're out there, if you go out that way today, it is all private property, but you can still see when the brush is down, you can still see what we believe is the foundation of the sheep barn that is still out there today. Now, I was mentioning some of the stories about the garret in the attic. One of them goes that, shortly in 1862, not long after, I believe, Sheriff Filkins became the sheriff, he made a surprise visit out to the house. Wash and Cornelia were there. They received him cordially, and he went about, asked to search the house. And they were up in the attic when he noticed some loose floorboards. So he pulled up the boards and found a hole kind of down under the floor, but he couldn't really see in that hole. So he went down the stairs to get a candle or a lantern so he could see better, told the deputy that was with him to watch everything. Well, as soon as he left, Wash jumped in there, grabbed these bags of loot, and threw them into the other side of the attic that had already been searched. Well, apparently the deputy was more scared of Filkins than he was of Wash, because as soon as Filkins came back, he told him where the bags were. And of course, they found some stolen property. Wash paid a $500 fine and $500 for bail. And that was, again, that was pretty light sentencing for them at that time. Now, these are a couple of views today from up on the pinnacle. If you're familiar, the site where the Loomis homestead was is now there's private property, but there's actually, the owners have a yurt that they rent out like as an Airbnb. It's called the Loomis Lair. And so these are views you can see on their website. So I took these off their website. You can get a feeling for why you would want to have that as a hideout, because you have quite a good view on a good day, quite a distance from up there. And what I think make sure I tell you, the one on the left in particular, I think you're looking out across the 9 Mile Swamp there. Like I said, we've talked about the 9 Mile Swamp. Just down the road from the Loomises is the Tinker Hollow School. This is where the Loomis children went to school, especially the girls. They would go there and then most likely to the White Squirrel Seminary, sort of for finishing school. So they were all very well educated. Now, In 1851, George Sr. is going to die, and at that time there's going to be a meeting up on the Pinnacle where they divide up the territory of the gang. Bill, the oldest brother, is going to get the northern area, which will include the areas in Canada where Wheeler is at. Grove has the area to the south, all the way down towards Scranton, Pennsylvania, in that area. Wash is going to get the eastern section, which includes Albany, where the legislature is, Saratoga Springs, Vermont area in there. And then another gang member who named by the name of Big Bill Rockwell is going to have the western section to kind of lead up. The gang is going to be on wanted posters, and there's going to be matters, in the paper, left and right. Folks are really, there's going to be a point where there's like 100 gang members at this point. And you're going to start once George passes, but you're going to start really seeing more tension in the gang between George and his mother Rhoda on who's going to really lead the gang. At this point, Wash is a big gang with lots of feelers out, bringing in loot, and so forth. Rhoda would like to have a smaller, family-run gang that, has fewer people to divide the loot amongst. So that's some of the tension that's going on here at the time. One of the examples of some of the specific tension that's going on, this occurred in 1861, and I actually can read it pretty well, but just to give you a paraphrase, this is called a careless accident in the newspaper. Most think it wasn't really an accident. A young lady, Hannah Wright, who lived out at the homestead with Wash, and some would say it was his wife, although we've never been able to verify a marriage license between them. They did have a child together. She was in the kitchen working around the hearth, cooking and so forth, when one of the members of the gang accidentally put a loaded gun kind of into the fire, and it exploded, and the shot got into her leg, which at this time created an infection, and within a few days she died from those injuries. Wash happened to be away at the time. Another member of the gang went towards Albany, where he was supposedly trying to find him and get him back as quickly as possible. But it was during this time that when Wash got home, he realized that he was pretty sure his mother and maybe one of his brothers was behind this act, and he was very concerned for his little son, who was really just an infant at that time. And so he took, Grove Jr. was the little boy's name, took him to the house of Richard Gordon and his wife in Stockwell, who were related to Hannah, his wife, and asked them to raise the child as their own. He would provide money to help with his upbringing, but he really didn't want the little boy to know that he was his father at that time. Now, over the years, I believe he did know that Wash was his father, because in later years, when he was about 13, Rhoda and Cornelia would come and take the boy from the Stockton's house, the Gordon's house, and under the auspices that he needed better clothing and to be better cared for, but they still thought that they were going to do him some harm at that point. And so the sheriff actually was able to retrieve the boy from the Loomises and bring him back home. But that's an example of sort of the tension and how that dynamic was push and pull between Wash and Rhoda through the years. So, how did the community deal with all this? I mean, every week there's different things happening in town, theft and people being robbed, and you can't say for sure that they were all the Loomises doing this, but it was hard not to suspect them. So, a couple things happened. One is there was some groups that were created. The Waterville Theft Detective Society was was one. Madison County had the Madison Anti-Larceny Society. There was also, I think, another group that was called, another kind of anti-theft group. Those were started in the communities to try to keep an eye on things. It would be kind of like our neighborhood watches today, right? They would get together, have meetings, discuss what was happening, try to come up with strategies about how to stop some of this that was happening. So one person that was really interested in getting all this bad theft and bad things to stop is William J. Bissell. He was a local merchant in Waterville. He owned the hardware store, was a very active businessman. He was the gentleman that started the Theft Detective Society in Waterville. They met over his store. But besides that, Bissell actually believed in a kind of what was called the California solution at the time of kind of fixing these kind of problems. And that says that when officials and juries are corrupt and don't punish criminals, it's the right of the people to take matters into their own hands and punish these criminals. That's in part why he started these groups. But it's also why he was very active in drawing James Filkins to Waterville. James Filkins had run for sheriff in Brookfield. He did not win that election. He lost by a matter of 3 votes. And surprisingly, one of the Loomises was helping count votes. So, hard to say what happened there, right? But shortly after that, William Bissell approached Filkins about moving from Brookfield to Waterville and running for the Waterville sheriff's position. And so he did. He won that election. He was an interesting man. He supposedly had kind of a temper, wasn't necessarily well liked in the community, but he was very well respected because from the start, Filkins is going to try to hold the Loomis Gang accountable. If he got leads on something that he felt he could act on, he would do it. He would start making their lives a little miserable because he was really tracking them and their actions on a regular basis. So he became sheriff in 1862 and served to about 1879. Like I said, he moved his family here, and that included his wife, Sarah. Now, one of the stories I want to read you from the Waterville Times has to do with something that occurred in July of 1863, so a little over, roughly a year after he became sheriff. There was an attempt to murder Sheriff Filkins. So, again, let me take a sip of water so I can read this without stumbling here, but you can't get any more colorful than the Waterville Times in the period. So, an attempt to murder Officer Filkins. A most daring and scoundrelly attempt to murder Officer Filkins of this village was made on Thursday of last week, which came very near being successful. About 11 o'clock that night, the villains who attempted the deed knocked at the kitchen door of Mr. Filkins' house. A few feet west of the kitchen door, on the same side of the house, is a bedroom with one window in it where Mr. Filkins sleeps. In this room was 2 beds, in one of which 4 small children were sleeping. A light was burning in the room, Mrs. F. having a sick child to attend to. Mr. Filkins, hearing the noise made at the door, got up, slipped on his pants and stockings, taking his revolver in his hand as a matter of precaution, went to the kitchen window, the blinds of which were fastened, and asked what was wanted. He was answered by one of the cutthroats with, "I work for Mr. Clark, and last night Clark saw Jack Van Dee at his father's house. If you go there, you can arrest him." Mr. Filkins, who was quite sure he recognized the speaker's voice, instantly suspected treachery and dropped the curtain which he had partially raised, withdrew from the window a few feet and a little to one side, and was in the act of cocking his revolver when a charge of buckshot and revolver bullets fired from a gunshot crashed through the blinds and windows, some of which struck his right arm between the wrist and elbow, passing clear through into the thumb and wrist of the left hand, tearing them up badly. He instantly called to his wife to put out the light, saying, "I am wounded." He then went, bleeding profusely, into the hall with the intent of arousing Mr. Thomas Westnich, a disabled soldier who occupied the upper rooms of the house. But although he still retained his revolver in his grasp, his wounds had weakened him to such an extent that he was unable to raise the latch on the stair door. After this, he passed through several rooms, hardly knowing what he was doing, until he began to feel faint, when he started for his bedroom with the view of getting upon the bed, but only succeeded in reaching a lounge which was near the bedroom door, upon which he sank and fainted. Shortly after the first gun was fired, 2 charges came in rapid succession through the bedroom window. These last shots were fired at an angle which carried them into the wall on the east side of the room. Had their course been the opposite angle, sure death to some of the children in the bed must have been the result. The window curtain was perforated with nearly 50 shot and bullet holes. Dr. William P. Cleveland and Dr. George Bailey were called and dressed the wounds, and Mr. Filkins is in fair way to recover. Jack Van D, whom the villain spoke of, is the brother of the girl Frances Van D, who was examined and held to bail last week Tuesday on the charge of receiving and secreting stolen goods. He is supposed to have been not concerned in the same affair, but has succeeded in avoiding arrest thus far. After firing the last 2 shots, the would-be assassins fled. It is supposed that they were either 2 or 3 in number, but as the night was very dark, it is impossible to determine which. So it goes on a little bit more to talk about that event, but you can see the Loomis Gang very quickly was eager to get rid of Officer Filkins. It would be noted that the paper said a few weeks later that Filkins was recovering well from his wounds. So this is going to be sort of this is the indictment, I should mention, against Amos Plum and I believe Hiram Denayo Loomis, because those are the 2 voices that Sheriff Filkins believed he heard that night that were out there. And so this is one of several indictments that the Waterville Historical Society has in our archives. It's amazing at the number of indictments that were put in against the Loomis Gang over the years, and very few of them actually stuck. So again, they didn't kill the sheriff. The sheriff recovers, and this keeps going back and forth, this little tug of war. The Loomises do things. There's stories in the paper. So-and-so is arrested for counterfeiting. This one is indicted on that. But it still just keeps harassing the community members. You can hardly imagine what it's like to live in Waterville when all these activities are going on a regular basis. And if you do stand up to the Loomises, it was very likely that maybe your barn might catch fire, or your crop might all of a sudden burn, or something else might happen to your home. And so people were kind of scared to come forward with these different situations and incidents that were happening all the way, around the town. There's one story, for example. There was an African-American worker that had been treated pretty badly by the Loomises. He worked for the Loomis family. He decided that it was time to move on, and he tried to collect his wages and leave. When they refused to pay him, he threatened to go and tell everything he knew to the sheriff. Considering that, they said they would consider that, but they would pay him after his next day of work. Well, during that next day of work, a Sid went flying through the field and he was killed. And so, obviously, he didn't get his pay or get to tell what he knew about what happened in his household. Side, yes. Okay, side. Yes, sorry. So like I said, lots and lots of stories in the paper, all kinds of different things happening. Oh, actually, I want to mention this one. The one in the middle there, it says, on Friday night of last week, a buffalo skin, an overcoat, and a whip were stolen at the schoolhouse in Tinker Hollow. That's the school I showed you the picture of. where a singing school was being held. A gentleman who happened to be on the road met a man on horseback with the articles in his possession going towards the Loomises. The loser, upon being informed of this fact, proceeded at once to the Loomises and demanded the property, which was given up. It's a shame that the scoundrelly gang is permitted to continue their depredation on people as they do. The country ought to be rid of them in some manner. Okay, so I mentioned that because the Loomises were not opposed to putting their own things in the newspaper. So this is a letter to the editor. Now the first part is about a different incident, but we'll show, the second paragraph is related to that one I just read you. Letter to the editor, I noticed in your publication of February 20th a statement relative to a grist which was said to have been stolen and tracked or followed from Clarksville to our place. In answer, I will say there is not one word of truth in your informant's statement. It is like the Utica Herald stating that Charlie Chaplin's horse and cutter that Dennison stole was found at Wash Loomis's. Yours, G.W.W. Loomis. So he's countering something that had been printed previously in the paper. What's really interesting is below is sort of this redaction from the story that I told you about. We are told by Mr. Eli Wells that we are in error as regards our statement about the articles which were stolen at the schoolhouse at Tinker's Howell on Tuesday night of last week. The loser informs us that the articles were not taken by the Loomis boys, but they greatly assisted them in recovering the property which was stolen by other persons. I don't know. Sounds like maybe there might have been a little intimidation going on there, huh? So they had to kind of frisk the change in the story. So this is a picture of the Morrisville Courthouse, and in 1864, and you can see the firemen there, that Morrisville Courthouse caught fire. When the flames were first noticed, obviously a pumper was brought out and its hoses were unrolled, only to find out that they'd been cut in several places. It just so happened that Wash Loomis was in town for a trial, and he turned up at the scene of the fire to help put it out. And when he saw the sorry state of the hoses, he said, "It's a damn outrage, and I would like to hang the man that did this." So the courthouse ended up burning to the ground, and with all of its records, which included a number of indictments and a lot of evidence in cases against the Loomis Gang. So obviously it could not be proven that they started the fire, but I guess today we would say it was under suspicious circumstances for sure. So shortly after this, that things really kind of come to a head. I mean, this is, you can figure this is going on for years, right? So on actually Halloween of 1865, this is the headlines from that night. Midnight descent on the Loomis premises. Wash Loomis killed. Grove Loomis badly beaten. Plum and Tenio run for their lives. The house fired. The barn and 6 horses burned. Hay and straw stacks burned. So what happens is that Wash is beaten to death. And his brother Grove is severely beaten. As it says, Plum and Tenio run from the house, flee over to their neighbor, the Masons, which we still have. The Mason family is still neighbors to that property today. I'm trying to think of Mr. Mason's name. But every year for our Loomis Country tours, he actually loans us a revolver that is supposedly a Loomis family revolver that has passed down in his family for generations. Roger Mason, that's it. Just popped in my head. This is such a big event, right? The Wash is killed. He's the leader of the gang. The others are injured. They flee. Their house has been burned out. They've lost their crops. Everybody thinks this will sort of be the end of the Loomis Gang. The bad news is that a grand jury indicts Sheriff Filkins for the murder of Wash Loomis. They're claiming that his the sheriff's revolver. And it was, this is going to be a long, drawn-out case. We think our court cases go for a while here. The initial witnesses to this are going to be all Loomis Gang members. They have statements from Rhoda, Cornelia, and today, we would consider those hostile witnesses. Not the most reliable sources, but those are the sources on which this indictment is based. Now, it goes through, what's interesting is the sheriff is able to continue his job while he's being indicted for this. It's not what we would do today again, but he is still on the job. It's interesting, he gets charged with 5 counts, the most serious being the murder of George Washington Loomis. Additionally, he has counts for assault with intent to kill Grove, 1 for arson in the 1st degree, 1 for arson in the 3rd degree, 1 for arson in the 4th degree. The judge, here's arguments on both sides, and he sets the bail for Filkins at $10,000 for the murder charge and just charges the other charges on Filkins on his own reconnaissance. That's the one indictment. 28 people from Sangerfield, all very respectable citizens, raised the $10,000 to bail out the sheriff. They have that kind of confidence in his ability and don't believe that he was necessarily, the person that was responsible for killing Walsh. It's interesting to think about how this court case is going to go. Because the witnesses, most of them are gang members, when they go to get ready for hearings or testimony, they couldn't be found. So there'd be postponement after postponement after postponement on this. Eventually, the sheriff is, that case against the sheriff is going to be, set aside. He's not going to even have to go to trial. But it's going to be one of those things kind of hanging over his head for quite a while because of all of these, antics by the Loomis Gang. And they actually had hoped that the judge would put him in jail and hold him until the trial, and then they would be rid of the sheriff. But that's not what happened. So, next thing that happens goes back on up here at the homestead. As I mentioned, the sheriff, so that was Halloween of 1865. Things keep continuing, and on June 9th of 1866, the sheriff has to go back up to his homestead because he's still, even though he's still under indictment, he is still working. And let me see if I can find this one real quick. I brought some of the articles if anybody wants to look at them afterwards. So the next thing that happens is there is a shooting at the Loomis place. And this is another encounter between the officers of the law and the band of desperados known as the Loomis Gang. Has just taken place at the Loomis residence in this town. On Saturday morning last, a man who gave his name as Jones called at Officer Filkins' residence and informed his wife that the parties with a stolen horse had come to the Loomis place the night before and that he could effect their arrest by going there. Mr. Filkins arrived home from Iowa the same day, whither he had been on official business, and proceeded at once to act upon the information he received. Mr. Filkins' own statement of the affair is very full and, of course, is correct. We give it, remarking that in making it, he forgot to mention that the parties in the house fired upon him twice from the windows and doors after he had gone out of the house. So this is the statement. I got information yesterday, Saturday, upon my return from Iowa, that some horse thieves whom I had been after for a long time came to the Loomis's last Friday night, and I could probably capture them by going there. I left Waterville for the Loomis's about 10 o'clock Saturday night with Constable Stanford of Waterville. Inquiring along the way, I learned that there were other parties at Loomis's that Deputy Sheriff Conger of North Brookfield had warrants for. Sanford and I went down to North Brookfield and informed him of the fact. Conger and Constable Hibbert of North Brookfield then accompanied Sanford and I and the 4 other men that formed our party to the Loomis house in the south part of the town of Sangerfield. All of us surrounded the house a little after daylight Sunday morning. Mrs. Rhoda Loomis, the mother, was at the back door feeding ducks, and as soon as she saw us, she hollered out to the man in the house, "Here is Filkins with a lot of men." We entered the house and went up the stairs, seeing that the Loomis party had gone up in the garret. Conger and I started to go up the garret stairs together, Conger a little ahead. At this time, someone, I cannot possibly say who, stood at the top of the stairs with a gun and said, "Go back," and I'm going to blacked out, but it was, "God damn you," or "I will shoot you through." Conger advanced, and the unknown man struck him with the gun, inflicting an ugly wound in the head. I now, being some 15 feet from the unknown man, shot at him with a revolver. Do not know whether I hit him or not, but I aimed for his breast, and the man now attempted to strike Conger again, and I shot at him a second time, taking aim at his head. Do not know whether I hit him or not. Someone then fired a gun, shot down the stairs. Do not know that anyone was hit. As Conger and I started to go downstairs, we met a stranger whom, upon being asked his name, gave it, but I now forget it. I asked him if old Bill Alford was up the stairs. He said there was someone who came in with him a night or two before, named Bill. Conger put the handcuffs on the Canadian, and as Conger with his prisoner and some other men went out of the house towards the road, the party from the garret fired upon them several times. The prisoner was hit in the shoulder and breast with buckshot, wounding him considerably, though not dangerously. Another man, named Ward, was also shot. Conger and his party then went away for help. I stayed there with the others to watch the house. Soon we saw a man come out of the house with a gun and started for the woods and followed him, and he fired at us with a repeating mini rifle. He fired at us several times as we followed him, and the last hit me, inflicting a wound in the arm and one in the leg. I do not know who the man was, and I do not remember much after this. Now it goes on to talk more about his wounds and the rest of the incident there with the party. So what's interesting about this situation is, this was really the final straw for many of the men in the area, and we're going to talk about the last big incident next. But before I do, I want to mention the interesting thing here that is that just a few weeks before, Sheriff Filkins had actually purchased a life insurance policy on himself that paid out if he was incapacitated or upon his death. And so it was through the Travelers Insurance Company, which is an insurance company we still have around today. And so this, on June 29th, 1866, this letter, sort of from Travelers Insurance, was printed in the paper. So someone had notified them that Officer Filkins was shot in the line of duty. And so his policy was in the sum of $5,000 in case of death, or $25 a week for disability by accident. And so someone had wrote to the company, and this is the response from the insurance company. I think very different than what we would get today. My dear sir, your favor of the 11th, advising us of the personal injuries sustained by Mr. James L. Filkins in an encounter with a gang of desperados, has been received. No apologies were needed for having insured Mr. Filkins, knowing that the Loomis Gang were not pleased with his ways. We only regret that the insurance was not larger, and if he had succeeded in killing the whole gang, we would cheerfully have made him a pensioner for life. The authorities of your county, and after 20 years' experience, cannot provide a safe residence for the Loomis, safe residence from the Loomis family. We beg you to insure all the constables, and the Travelers Insurance Company will provide for them. Never hesitate to insure a plucky fellow like Filkins for fear some scamp may kill him. If we could heal him as easily as we can pay him, our joy would be full. The custom of this company is to pay only on maturity of the claim. In this case, however, you are authorized to draw on us at sight, either weekly or monthly, as it may suit his convenience. The amount of his compensation, $25 per week. So he was at least covered for pay while he was recuperating from these injuries. And as I mentioned, this was going to kind of be the final straw for the folks in the community. I have to remember, by now, the Civil War is over, so a lot of men that have been fighting the Civil War are back home, and they are just kind goes out to the Loomis homestead. There are law enforcement officers involved, but there's about 100 men from Madison and Oneida counties. They go out there at dawn, and they surround the house. What hasn't been burned previously starts getting burned again. Literally, there were ladies throwing things out the windows, and the men were chucking them back in the windows so that they were all burned. This is when Plum gets hung 3 times. They're trying to get him to confess to all the crimes. Kind of naively, he promises to reform, and they let him go. I don't know why. Obviously, he wrote off and warned other gang members about what was happening. But this is really the sort of starting point of the breakup of the Loomis Gang. I mean, they'll still be around. They're going to try to regroup in different places. But Rhoda and Cornelia and Hiram move out on the west end of Lake Oneida. The band kind of starts disbanding a bit, and there's no strong organization to it shortly after this point. Now, the tree that they hung him from, a piece of it used to be at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown. I don't know if it's still in their collection or not, but it was on display for a while in an exhibit called New York Village Amusements. Rhoda tries to sue and get reimbursement for some of their losses. I think she asked for like $22,000. They comes out with like about $1,000. As I mentioned, the soldiers are back, so they're kind of not going to take any of this. So it really starts, sort of diffusing the gang at this point. Now, Sheriff Wilkins remains sheriff for a little while longer, but in early 1870s, 1879, he ends up separating from his wife and moving into Utica, where he's a watchman for a while. He comes back to Waterville in 1892 after he becomes ill, and his wife cares for him until his death in 1893. And he is buried in the Northfield Cemetery. Some say he kind of is sitting on a little bluff that kind of points towards the 9 Mile Swamp, and he's still kind of keeping an eye on that Loomis Gang, but it's hard to say. So, that's kind of a recap of the Loomis Gang. I mean, obviously, they would steal just about anything that wasn't nailed down. And how they got off all these things is, burning courthouses, influencing judges, paying off people. They supposedly had, hundreds of people in their pockets at that time. And it was just a very interesting time to live in Waterville and Sangerfield. So at this point, I will close and see if anybody has any questions.
Sure. Since they came from lawyers and doctors, why did they get into stealing? Why didn't they go into respectable careers and make something of themselves? It seems like they go in that direction.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I guess George just had a tendency to take the easy route, and he liked horses, so he kind of collected other people's. And Rhoda's family, obviously her dad, when he met her, was getting arrested for counterfeiting, so they just, both of those two together had a sort of crime history in their background, I guess you would say.
I thought law-abiding was for suckers and they were...
Yeah, and again, Rhoda's philosophy is everybody steals, only the dumb ones get caught. So, everybody should do it. That's the easy way out. Yes?
At one point, Diane, you showed, it looked like a group sitting in front of a house.
Yes.
Do you mind going back to that
Sure.
picture? And I don't know if you're able to identify who's who, but
I
I'm
just
curious.
just figure out how to get out of this, and I can go right back to that slide. There we go. That is Wheeler's family.
Oh, okay.
Hang on a second.
So that's not the whole...
No, it's not. You're seeing all this? Okay, let me see how I can get that. I can't see my little slides here on the side for some reason. They're all blank. Just don't know which one. If this comes back up, I will certainly move. Here we go. There we go. Let me just slide up here to the slide. a picture of Wheeler's family. Wheeler is the gentleman with the gray beard in the center. I'm assuming his wife to the right of him, and probably his children and maybe grandkids there in the front. It's hard to say. But this would have been in probably while he was in Canada. And so, like I said, what's interesting is like Bill and Wheeler, after the gang started disbanding, they actually took up like respectable, positions as farmers in the community, and actually then went on to be more, respectable citizens after the gang disbanded. And like I said, he is buried back at the cemetery in Sangerfield. My understanding is Rhoda, Cornelia, and maybe Hiram and Plum also are buried there, but there is a large plot in the back corner that does not have any markers on it. It's very close to where the Preston marker is, which again, that was one of, related to the Prestons. That was George's sister's married name. And supposedly that's where they're buried without any markers. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the Civil War. Were any of the brothers in the Civil War?
No, actually, that's a really good question. I don't believe so, but I would have to go and check. That's a good question. I'll have to research that one. Thank you.
It's a long ride.
Yes. Yes.
Because I think with the story, they would sell horses to be used in the Civil War.
Yes, they
and
did.
They would steal them, so they were selling them 2 or 3 times.
Yes, they do have that tendency that they would, raid horses like in Pennsylvania or Virginia, bring them up and then resell them back to the Union Army. Yes, that is definitely one of the stories. There are plenty of stories. I should also mention while we're talking about stories, so we are actually just got a Pomeroy Foundation marker to put on the homestead site. It's actually up right now. We're hoping to dedicate it here sometime this spring. I'm trying to get the person that owns the property to know when he's in town so we can have him at the dedication as well. But those markers for the Loomis Gang, the Pomeroy Foundation likes to put them under folklore. As I told Wade one day, it kind of ruffles my feathers a little bit because we actually have the actual copies of the documents that prove that the Loomis Gang own that property. Primary source documents, the newspaper accounts of their exploits. So, some of them are definitely probably have been embellished over the years, but when you start reading the stuff from 1865, 1866, actually right when these things were happening, those are pretty accurate, pretty accurate, surely biased by whoever wrote that, like anything is, but pretty accurate for the time period of the story. So be on the lookout for when we're going to be dedicating that marker, hopefully in the next month or two. And I will also put a plug in that if you ever wanted to go on one of our Loomis Country tours, our date for this year is, I believe, August 23rd. It's a Saturday. We usually have 6 or 7 bus trips that go out through the countryside to all these different locations, where we do a narrative on the buses, and it's one of our major fundraisers. We also have a chicken barbecue then too. Chicken barbecue and Loomis tours.
Could you talk a little bit more about the counterfeiting? I assume it was the bills of sale or?
It was money and those still. In fact, I think a couple little articles talk about there were phony, like, I don't remember, I think one of them was even $2 bills, which might have been a thing at the time, with $1 bills and stuff being passed around and burning. They would print the money and then try to get it, give it away at stores and so forth. So that happened quite a bit. Grove in particular seemed to be heavily involved in the counterfeiting business side of things. There's several indictments for him for counterfeiting over the years.
On the printing press or?
They would have to have had a printing press or some way to print that at the time. But they were
Or
very,
big foods with
somebody, yes. Well, and again, they were very notorious for, I guess you'd say, paying people off, both, whether it's judges or witnesses or whatever. So they could have just been, had a really good deal with somebody to let them use their equipment, but they definitely did get a lot of counterfeiting.
the newspaper printer.
I don't think it was the Waterville Times. They were definitely not fans of the Loomis.
Maybe you'll hire her. How far afield do you think they went to steal horses? So I mean,
Well, so-
people would eventually run out of horses and.
So the gang really operated, like you said, into southern Canada, out west into the Ohio Valley, and as far south really as to like probably northern Virginia. It was pretty much the entire northeastern part of the United States. They had,
Just a local
yeah, no, they were locally based here, but they had feelers and contacts all the way out there. And again, at some point, the gang was over 100 members, so these people would be out in these different areas. But this was sort of the home base. No, it wasn't. That's what Rhoda wanted, to keep it just the family. Wash wanted a bigger gang that could go farther and wider and bring in more. Yes?
Did any of them ever spend any time in jail?
Well, Bill spent a little time in jail. He was the first one that was convicted. I think a few of them spent a few days, but as far as like the amount of their crimes, the amount of time they spent was really very small. As we saw in the 1864 incident where they burned the courthouse, besides, they realized after the fact that some of the stuff wasn't in the courthouse, it was in another building adjacent. Well, within a matter of a few weeks, that building mysteriously burned down. And Oneida County, the outgoing district attorney somehow cut a deal that all those indictments were swept away. Who knows what that cost, but somehow he did that on his after he lost the election. So there was all kinds of little things that happened that kept them from really going to jail in the long run.
That was an amazing operation.
It was
I always
expensive.
thought it was like 4 or 5 guys hanging out in the swamp, stealing some horses there.
No, it was pretty
Wow,
extensive.
good for that.
And it's really kind of interesting that it was like a yes.
Was Roscoe Kaufman involved as a lawyer in some of those?
Yes, he was. Moshan, as he was an assistant district attorney, and he was the one prosecuting some of Loomis cases, and I believe that he was also involved in the Filkins case. I think he might have been defending Filkins at that point. He was maybe no longer the district attorney, and I think he was brought into, if I remember right, to defend Filkins. Now, again, the craziness on that is, again, unreliable witnesses. You can't find them, they can't come to court, you can't bring them in. Well, after a while, they basically said, this is enough is enough, and we're setting aside these charges.
What book would you recommend as being the best for
Oh.
reading about the Loomis Gang?
Let's see, and I'm not great with my authors, but there's
Frontier Justice,
Frontier Justice is a good one for sure,
Victoria.
yes. Yep.
He's from Clinton.
We sell, I think, 2 different versions of Loomis Gang books at the Waterville Historical Society. But I also would recommend that if anybody wants to look at any of these articles, come and make an appointment and come and read some of the Waterville Times stuff. It is so colorful and so fascinating to see what was really happening. And you could almost, for a few years there, in the peak of the late 50s, early 60s, you could almost go through every issue and find something on the Loomis Gang. Yes?
Do you have any idea who the writers were any time?
Of the Times, I do not off the top of my head. We could probably go back and find out who the editor was at that time, but I don't know for sure. There's not really an author's byline.
Just one other question, like after they moved to east of Oneida Lake and all this happened, there's a book that the Onondaga County Historical Society helped print that attributes some of the money that went into the women's movement to the horse stealing of the Loomis Gang. And I was just curious, since Rhoda was such a strong woman and her daughter,
I could see
is
that.
possible?
I could see that as a possibility. I have not found that, but I will have to research
There's a
that and
book,
see if we
yeah.
can find any ties to that. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that tip. And you have a question?
So we were wondering what happened to Filkins' house. Filkins' house, like, I'm from
well,
North
okay,
Brookfield as well, and I think he grew up, or he lived on the same road I grew up on.
So Filkins was his house, if you know where St. Bernard's Church is, and there's the rectory right
okay.
next to it. There's a vacant lot right on the corner of what is Bacon and 12.
Okay.
The house was seated right there. It is no longer there. Now, Filkins actually died in a house on Sanger Ave. It's, people I knew that lived there were the Tucsons. But I have to go back and see who lived it historically, but it's a two-story white Victorian on Sanger Ave. That is where he died in 1892.
It wasn't on Keith Road.
I don't think so. He lived right on the corner, from what I understand, he lived right on the corner of West 12 and Bacon
Okay.
Street at the time.
Right.
Yes.
Are there still a lot of descendants in this area?
There are quite a few descendants. When we do the Loomis country tours, we get usually some Loomis descendants. We actually had some Loomis and Filkins descendants on the same bus trips. Fortunately, they get along, and there's no foolishness. Trying to think of her name. A lady last spring reached out. She is a descendant of the Loomis Gang, and she actually donated to the Historical Society Rhoda Loomis's coverlet. It's, got the block in the corner, Rhoda Loomis. It was a very nice, it has a few rough spots, but, again, considering its age, that's great. There are definitely still Loomis descendants around, and I think you said you were right?
Yeah, my grandmother was Fern Loomis, and her father was William Loomis, and they lived most of the time, Ilion, Sangerfield, and, but she died when I was 7, so I don't recall much, but I know that she, was very ashamed, and, the children at school, she said, wouldn't play with her, and, because her last name was Loomis.
Well, and
My father.
I've heard that from other folks, that, the generation post the gang was, embarrassed by their heritage. They had situations where children and grandchildren at school had a hard time. People, just like we were talking about the armored car service, they weren't trusted because their last name was Loomis, things like that. So, yeah, I've heard that from other descendants, that that has been passed down in their family history as well.
Yeah, and the Loomis Chafee, the prep school, has made available a lot of genealogy that they maintain there.
Okay, great. That's good to know too. Thank you. Any other? Yes.
Yeah, who owns the swampland today? And has anybody ever tried to find their way in there where they used to?
I do think some people, I don't know who owns it, quite honestly, I'd have to go back and see, but I think there is a 9 Mile Swamp Conservancy that is looking to preserve the swamp, more from the natural environment than the history of the Loomis Gang. And I do know there's some streams that go through there that people kayak and stuff. That's a good question as well. Other questions? Yes.
I was just mentioned that we've kayaked on it. It's a very nice place to kayak. There's beautiful fountain grass there, and it's very still and placid. It's a great place to go.
I haven't tried it myself, well, thank you, that's good, that's a good endorsement.
Where do you put in?
Huh?
Hubbardsville.
Dang, hi.
Oh, hi.
Where do you guys put in your kayaks?
Jamie.
Yes.
Where do you put your kayak in at? To go into the swamp? Where do
I
you-
can't remember. It was over 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
It's in Hubbardsville.
Hubbard?
All right, well, thank you all for
All right.
coming